All right, if you've got your Bibles or your New Testaments with you this morning, I invite you to turn to John's Gospel, chapter 11. The reality is that the entire chapter is our text. But there's roughly 48, 49, 50 verses, something like that. We're not reading them all. So relax. However, we are going to read quite a few of them. And we're going to begin at verse 1, where John tells us that now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Martha, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, "Let's go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you're going back?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It's when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought that he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. And for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." And Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection of the last day." And Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world." Most, if not all of us, have looked at dreams and hopes and plans that simply were lost. As if buried in a grave, those dreams and hopes and plans seem gone forever. Whether it's a failed marriage, broken relationships with adult children, or former friends, or for whatever other reasons, the future often can seem, well, shall I say, hopeless. We're speaking of those times in life when we can no longer do what we used to be able to do. Perhaps it's because of a chronic illness or financial problems. Perhaps it's because of lost employment or a simple handicap that makes each and every day so difficult. I'm just talking about where life has suddenly grown to be empty. Exactly the way those moments must have felt for Mary and Martha as they stood beside their brother's grave, because their world had changed forever. Listen, the road to Easter runs through a cemetery. As in so many times in life, we struggle before we arrive at our destination. Despite our best efforts, the future seems kind of sealed away from us. The sisters had sent word to Jesus of their brother Lazarus, who was also Jesus' friend. They had sent word to Jesus regarding his illness. And as the first of our gospel lesson reminds us, they had done a lot for Jesus. With the world turning against Jesus, it had been Mary who anointed his feet with perfume and wiped it off with her hair. Bear in mind, it was Mary and Martha who had provided Jesus with a place to stay in Bethany, which was just located just outside of Jerusalem. I mean, let's be honest. The feeling they were having, isn't that the feeling that we have when things turn against us, despite the fact that we have prayed? Despite the fact that we thought we were going the extra mile? Despite the fact that we see ourselves as good persons? Here's the thing. As with so many times in life, what appears to be an ending can in fact be a beginning. Where we only see death, we can actually see the power of life. Where we only see failure, God can open a new door. Where we feel abandoned, God draws us near and we find hope and we find assurance. What we are celebrating on this road to Easter is, even though we travel through the reality of loss and downturns, defeats, disappointments, despite we traveling through that, there is a power in the world that is stronger than death. There's a power in the world that's stronger than even our fear of death. Because our gospel that we read today, it deals with who's going to have the last word. At first, the focus of today's gospel from John is on a sunset. His friend Lazarus has died. Mary and Martha's brother has passed away. But it quickly is a story that turns to a sunrise. And we have the joy and the hope of Easter even today, 2 weeks early. We're talking about victory for those who seem defeated. Because you see, while the season of Lent is one of preparation and repentance, Sundays are always a celebration of the resurrection of Easter. But before we can get to the joy of Easter, John's account reminds us of the sorrow and the grief that had control of Mary and Martha's lives. And Martha confronts Jesus with it. She confronts Jesus with the fact that if he had been there when Lazarus was dying, it wouldn't have happened. And when Jesus tries to comfort her by saying that he's going to live again, she fails to understand. She took his assurance to be a theological statement, rather than a promise for the present. In the abstract, she agreed with Jesus. But in the present, her heart was still broken. You see, Martha believed, but she was yet to understand. And Lent is a time of preparation for Easter. What I mean by that is we can never know the full impact of the resurrection unless we are honest with those times when we have felt no hope, not seen a way to go on, or felt that we were simply alone. Similar to how Mary and Martha must have felt when Jesus was not there in their time of need. Their brother was dying, and John tells us that Jesus delayed his return. But from the feeling of being abandoned will come that overwhelming joy when Lazarus comes forth from the grave. Joy that's not related to what occurs to us in life is simply false joy. Only when you and I are honest with our hurts and our fears can we know the full impact of the truth that God is with us. I mean, we've all dealt with the loss of one or more persons that we love and care about. You know. We've all had times of despair. We've all had those times of grief, sorrow, but being honest with where we are can open our hearts and our minds to the good news of Easter. We have to be honest with ourselves, and we have to be honest with God when we feel hopeless. Because feelings of optimism that are not connected to who we are and where we are is nothing more than false optimism. Folks, the power of the Easter faith that we're getting a preview of today in the gospel account of Lazarus being called from the grave is whatever happens to us in our world, our God is greater. And we can trust in Him. We can believe in Him. You and I will always have reason to hope. Indeed, the road to Easter runs through a cemetery. It's not a road that detours through the realities of life, but rather it's a road that can empower us to deal with the realities of life head on. And not only that, but in our gospel lesson for today, we see the courage of Jesus to deal with the pain and the grief of Mary and Martha. Because here's the thing. Believe it or not, there was a risk for Jesus to go back to Bethany to be with Mary and Martha. It wasn't an easy turn in the road. You see, Jesus was warned, as we heard in our gospel, that some were seeking to stone Him. And His reply was to speak of walking in the light so that no one would stumble. In other words, Jesus wasn't going to allow the fear of others. He wasn't going to allow the sorrow of death. He wasn't going to allow anything else to darken His way. He wasn't going to allow anything to keep Him from going where He knew He was needed. And it was at this point in our gospel lesson that Thomas finds his voice. And Thomas speaks up. Let me just simply share with you for a moment that I think Thomas may very well have been one of the worst labeled people in all of history. I mean, what do we know him as? We know him as Thomas the Doubter, right? But in this instance, Thomas was bold. Because wasn't Peter. You know, we always tend to think that Peter's the first of the disciples to speak up. No, not this time. It's Thomas, who shows his boldness by saying to all the other disciples, "Let us also go that we may die with him." What was he doing? Thomas was demonstrating the power of faith to empower action in our lives, even on a road that's leading us through a cemetery. The 4 days that had passed since the death and burial of Lazarus had led to what you and I in Baptist churches might call casserole time. Okay? You say, what on earth is casserole time? Well, apparently the neighbors who had gathered at Mary and Martha's home to console them, perhaps bringing food. You know how it is? And when Mary responded to the call of Jesus, they went with her. Although we can be confident that they went not expecting what was going to happen, but to cry alongside Mary and Martha. And here's the thing, you and I need to take notice of the fact that these good neighbors, these very caring neighbors, well, they were all Jewish. You say, why does that matter? Because through the centuries, Christians have too many times focused on the Jews that were a part of the trial and death of Jesus, without realizing that most of those who Jesus worked with, lived with, and taught were what? Jews. His closest followers and family were Jewish. Perhaps John included this as a warning for us. As a warning for you and I not to allow the labels that we put on people to rob them of their God-given value. The scene that we see in the gospel at this point reminds us that neighbors caring for neighbors are good people, regardless of what their faith might be. But before Jesus could arrive back at Martha's home, she met him on the way. And she immediately confronted Jesus with her belief that if he had been there, Lazarus would not have died. It would have been very easy at that point for Jesus to become defensive. I mean, after all, those he was fleeing were people trying to stone him. He could have talked of this need to seek shelter. He could have talked of this need to be safe. But rather, he dealt with her sorrow as he assured Martha that her brother would live again. Martha took his reply to be the promise contained in the teaching about the resurrection, while Jesus would not let her stay in the creedal or the abstract, but rather reminded her that he was the hope. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Well, Martha seems convinced by these words, and she returns to the house in order to get her sister Mary. And when Mary came where Jesus was, she essentially repeated the same plea to Jesus as Martha, saying, in essence, Jesus, if you had been here, we wouldn't be going through this. However, this time it was said with tears. Jesus saw not only Mary crying, but all those who had come with her. Jesus' heart was broken because he had lost a very close and very dear friend. Listen, there are times when we are dealing with grief and tears that a simple, practical request can be helpful. Because you see, at this point, Jesus didn't try to deal with the matters of faith as he'd done with Martha, but he simply asked, where had they laid Lazarus? And they responded by inviting him to come and see. It's in that moment that we get a glimpse of the humanity of Jesus. As John tells us, he begins to weep. Again, he'd lost a dear friend. Again, he could see the pain of grief on the faces of two other friends, his sisters, Martha and Mary. Listen, sometimes the best thing we can do for another is to simply cry with them. Because his tears communicated an empathy that words simply could not. And the crowd's reaction was mixed, according to John. Some saw the tears as a sign of the depth of his love for Lazarus, and others couldn't help but ask the question so often asked at a time like this, why? Particularly as we read in a preceding chapter, if Jesus could give sight to a blind man, why couldn't he have kept his friend from dying? But when our hearts are broken, there's rarely an answer to the question that will satisfy the hurt. It's as if the writer of John is drawing a line under the words to emphasize the depth of Jesus' feelings. Because as he approached the grave, he was deeply disturbed again. Then Jesus took the first step of the miracle when he asked that the stone be removed. Now, as one might expect, Martha, the ever-practical one, she questioned that move. Essentially, she reminds Jesus that her brother had been dead for 4 days, and there's probably going to be an unpleasant odor when we remove that stone. Now, whatever word you and I might use to describe a 4-day-old dead body, Martha knew it wasn't going to be pleasant. Okay? She just knew that. But Jesus knew that if we're going to behold the glory of God, at times we have to get beyond the boundaries of the norm. He challenged whether she truly believed. So the stone was removed. And then comes the moment when Jesus calls Lazarus to come out. To come out. This isn't your normal gathering around a grave. In fact, the road to Easter had now reached a very important turn in the road. Lazarus came out. Lazarus came out. And when others saw this man who had been dead and buried, when they saw him alive, they found themselves being drawn to the one who had such power that he was able to call him forth from the grave. And though in the scene we see the power of God to give life, we also see the risk when that power is displayed. Because if you read further than we read today, it said that many of the Jews that had come out to be with Mary saw what Jesus had done and believed. Okay? But if you continue to read, there were others who sought to take his life. Listen, the Bible is full of stories about transforming situations that had become desperate and hopeless. Situations that are radically changed with new opportunities that are filled with promise and new life. Let's just go to the Old Testament for a moment. There's Abraham and Sarah, to whom God's promise seemed so impossible being revealed. So impossible that according to Scripture, Sarah did what? She laughed. There's no way we're going to have a child. We're beyond that. Transformed the situation. There was Moses, running for his life because there was a price on his head because he had murdered an Egyptian. There's Moses, wanted for murder, who's now being called to lead his people through the sea to the edge of the promised land. There's David, who faced a giant. There was Elijah, who after his greatest success, seeing no reason to live, found God in a still small voice. There was Ezekiel's vision of the scattered bones of a defeated army coming back to life. And it's not just the Old Testament. As we saw a couple of weeks ago in the New Testament, there's Nicodemus, shaking his head at being born anew, who's now bringing spices for Jesus' body. There's the Samaritan woman at the well that we talked about last week. A woman who's been ostracized by her village. And yet she finds in Jesus new life. Listen, we stand at this point on our journey toward Easter. And this is what we know. One, the world will not have the last word. Two, we will not have the last word. But three, God will have the last word. And four, these are days of new beginnings. On the road to Easter, we move toward the joy of Easter and the hope of the life everlasting when we experience the power of Jesus Christ in our lives. And that happens for you and I when the stones of bitterness and disappointment and sorrow are rolled away and we experience the call to come forth and live life at its fullest. You see, it's when we hear Jesus say, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. When we hear that, not only at the high and holy time of Easter, but when we hear that in a cemetery that's filled with grief and with sorrow. Because then and only then do those words come alive for you and me. You see, that's what I like about today's lesson. It comes when we least expect it. Jesus knew of God's power to deal with and to defeat death. The question for you and I this morning is, in our lives, can the stones be rolled away? Can you and I come forth to live? Based upon John's Gospel and the story of Lazarus, the answer is yes. Yes. We talk about Jesus, we talk about Him coming. Not only that we might have everlasting life, but as Jesus said, what? I have come that you might have life and have it to the full. May this be the day that we begin allowing God, through His Son Jesus Christ, to roll away the stones in order that we might live life more abundant.